In this video, we'll be going over the bottom-up 1D array approach of triangle. So previously in the 2D bottom-up approach, we can see that in each of the iteration, we are only relying on values from r plus 1, from the rows r plus 1. This means we can use a single array to represent our 2D matrix. Let's go over the thought process. So in the 2D bottom-up approach, in each of the iteration, we are only relying on values from the row r plus 1. This means we can create an array to represent our 2D matrix. Then in each of the row iteration, we will be updating the values from the previous iteration. Now let's go with the pseudocode. So we're going to create an array, min_sum, to keep track of the minimum path sum. Then we're still going to iterate through the indices from triangle.size -1 to 0, which is our current row. Then we're going to create a variable, prev, to keep track of the previous value at r plus 1, c plus 1. So if r is not at the last row, we're going to set prev to min_sum r plus 1. Else we can just set to 0. It's just a default value to 0. Then we're going to iterate through the columns from r to 0 denoted as c. If r is equal to the last row, we're going to have one value here. But before we set the current value at the minimum cell, we're going to save it first. So we're going to set prev to min_sum r, or min_sum c, basically saving the value before we have replaced it. Then we place the one choice that we have, or one last value that we have at min_sum c. Then we continue to the next iteration. Then before we replace the current value, we want to create a variable current and set it to min_sum c. Basically keep track of the current value before we have replaced it. Then we're going to pick the smaller value between min_sum r plus 1 and c, which is, if this is r plus 1, this means if we're representing the 2D matrix as an array, then r plus 1c is equal to the current cell, which is, we can just set it to between currents, and min_sum r plus c. Since we're iterating from, as we can see here, from columns is right to left, this is the previous value that we have before we have replaced it. So we can set it to prev. Then we can place x at min_sum rc, the current cell, and then we'll increment the current cell by the current value at the current cell inside the triangle. Then we can update set prev to the currents. Then we can return the minimum sum starting from the top. Now let's go over the time and space complexity. For the time complexity is over n squared because of the nested for loop, and then our space complexity is now the array, so it's over n, where n is the number of rows. This is the min_sum array. Now let's go over the code. So now we're going to convert our min_sum to an array. So it's min_sum triangle.size, and then we're going to iterate through our rows from the last row to 0, and then we're going to create a variable prev to keep track of the previous value before we have replaced it, which is the value at r plus 1, c plus 1. So we check if r is equal to triangle.size -1. This means it's at the last row, so there's no previous value. So we're going to just set it to 0. Else we can just set it to the min_sum at r plus 1. Then we're going to iterate through our columns from the last column of each row to 0. And then if r is at the last row, we're going to have one value here. But before we replace it, we want to save it at prev min_sum c. And then we can update the current minimum sum to the one value that we have here at rc. Then before we update the current minimum sum, we want to save it. So in current is go to min_sum rc, min_sum c, and then we want to update the current minimum sum. And then we want to pick the smaller value between going downward to r plus 1c. Since we have converted our 2D matrix into a 1D matrix, r plus 1c is the same as the current cell. So I'm going to just set it to current. And then minimum sum r plus 1, c plus 1 is the previous value that we had before we have replaced it. So let's go to pref. Then we can update our previous value to the current value before we have replaced it. Then we can return the minimum sum starting from the top. Let me know if any questions in the comment section below.